The orc was giving birth alone when the farmer found her, and the orc baby wasn't coming. In the middle of nowhere, under wind and dust, she screamed in pain as both their lives hung in the balance. He could have walked away, but he chose to stay. Trying to save them both was the right thing to do, but what happened next would change everything forever. The wind moved across the open plains, not as a breeze, but as something deliberate, a cold, cutting thing that sliced through cloth and skin alike, indifferent to the suffering of whatever it found in its path. The sky above was a seamless sheet of iron-grey cloud, swollen and low, the kind that pressed down on the world like a held breath. There were no trees here, no hills, no landmarks to offer shelter or direction. There was only the cracked, pale earth stretching in every direction, silent as a burial ground. This was the borderland, the stretch of forgotten ground that lay between the territories of men and the clans of the orcs, a place that belonged to neither side and was claimed by no one. 5 years had passed since the last blade had been drawn between the two peoples. 5 years since the armistice had been signed in blood and ash, and yet the borderland remained empty. Both sides had quietly agreed, without saying so aloud, to leave this scar of earth untouched, as if the land itself needed time to forget. There was no trail cutting through the grey grass, no road, no sign that any living thing had ever chosen to be here, and yet she was here. Ilara came to her knees slowly, the way a tall tree finally surrenders to the storm, not all at once, but in stages, each one more terrible than the last. Her massive green hands pressed into the cold earth, fingers spreading wide, searching for something solid to hold on to. Her breath came in ragged pulls, each one sharp-edged, each one stolen from a body that was rapidly losing the fight. The pain arrived without warning and without mercy. It detonated somewhere deep inside her abdomen and radiated outward in waves that blurred the horizon and turned the grey sky white. She doubled forward, a sound escaping her lips that was equal parts roar and sob, the voice of someone fighting not just pain, but terror. Something was wrong. Not the ordinary wrongness of labor, which she had prepared herself for, not the expected agony that every orc mother spoke of in low voices around the fire, the kind of pain that was brutal but purposeful. This was different. This was the silence between the push and the arrival, a silence that stretched far longer than it should have, filled only with the wind and her own ragged breathing. Her baby was not coming. I can't. She pressed both palms flat against her belly, the gesture half desperate and half a plea, as if her hands alone could correct what her body could not. Her tusks gleamed pale against the dark of her skin, her amber eyes wide and glassy with effort and fear. She had run for 3 days. 3 days of hard walking across broken country, moving only at night, eating almost nothing, driven by a single, absolute conviction. Her son would not be raised as a weapon. Ilara was the daughter of Gorath, lord of the Iron Tusk clan, a warlord whose name had once made human commanders go pale at their maps. The war was supposed to be everything. The war was supposed to be the purpose. And when it ended, Gorath had not mourned the peace. He had simply redirected its energy. The next generation would carry the old hunger. The grandchild he had not yet held would be trained from his first breath to be a soldier. But the war had been over for 5 years. 5 years of uneasy silence. 5 years of graves that neither side visited. 5 years of learning what it felt like to live without dying. And she had decided, quietly but irrevocably, that she wanted more than survival for her child. She had left before dawn, 3 days ago, without a word. And now she was here, alone, in the empty borderland, on her knees in the cold dirt with no shelter, no midwife and a baby that was not coming the way babies should. "Help me!" Her voice fell apart before it finished, swallowed by the wind, swallowed by the vast, indifferent emptiness of the plains. The grey sky pressed lower, and nobody answered. But somewhere, A few miles to the west, a man had just stopped his horse because he thought he heard something carried on the wind. Darian Osel was not the kind of man who was easy to describe. He was lean in the way that long years of outdoor work made a person lean, not thin, but stripped of anything unnecessary, every line of him defined by labor rather than design. His hands were thick-knuckled and permanently stained with the dark soil of the southern plains, and the creases around his eyes held more weather than age. He was somewhere in his middle years, though the exact count had stopped mattering to him after his wife passed. He had been farming the same plot for 11 years. Before the war ended, it had been dangerous work. The borderland was too close, and raiders from both sides had a habit of taking what they needed from whoever was too slow or too stubborn to run. Darian had been the latter. He'd stayed. He'd buried his wife in the field she'd loved. He'd kept working. The war's end had brought a strange kind of quiet to his life. The raids stopped. The soldiers stopped passing through. The world shrank down to just him and the land, and the rhythm of seasons, which suited him fine. He did not trust the peace entirely. A man who had lived through the war did not hand over that kind of skepticism quickly. But he had stopped sleeping with a blade under his mattress. That felt like progress. He was coming home from the far field, his horse moving at an unhurried walk, when the sound reached him. He pulled the horse to a stop. The animal's ears flicked forward. Its nostrils widened. It could hear it too. Darian sat very still for a moment, listening past the wind. It came again, not a trick of the gusts, not the cry of some animal. It was a voice, human in its shape but lower than human, rougher, heavier with pain, coming from the east, from the borderland. He did not think for long. Thinking for long was a luxury that the plains did not typically permit. He turned his horse and rode toward the sound. The borderland opened up before him, and he slowed as the terrain changed from his worn farming path to the pale, crackling earth that no one maintained. The sky was darker here, the clouds more dense, and the wind had taken on an edge that made his face sting. He scanned the flat expanse, looking for movement. He found her. She was perhaps 40 yards ahead. A large figure collapsed forward on her hands and knees in the dirt. For a moment, from a distance, his brain refused to fully assemble what he was seeing. The size, the color, the shape of the tusks catching the faint grey light. Then everything came together at once, and Darian felt his horse tense beneath him as his grip tightened on the reins, involuntarily. An orc, his jaw hardened. Every instinct sharpened by the war told him to turn around, to remember the burned farmhouse 2 miles north, the column of smoke he'd seen from his window 6 years ago, the things he'd heard from men who'd fought in the eastern valleys. He sat with that instinct for 1 full second. Then he heard her again, not a battle cry, not a threat, something far more human than that. The broken, desperate sound of someone who knew they were losing and was asking the empty air for help they did not expect to receive. He dismounted. The walk toward her felt longer than it was. His boots crunched softly against the dry earth. She heard him coming and turned, and for a moment they both froze, she on her knees, trembling, her amber eyes wide with pain and distrust, and he standing over her with his hands open and his heart doing something complicated in his chest. "Hey, easy. I'm here." His voice came out gentler than he expected. He barely recognized it. And Ilara, who had spent 3 days trusting no one, looked at the human standing above her and felt the worst kind of despair, the kind that arrives when you realize that the only help available is the help you feared most. Ilara's first instinct was to get up, to get distance, to remind her body, which had betrayed her by collapsing in front of a human, that she was the daughter of Gorath, and daughters of Gorath did not accept charity from enemies. She pushed herself sideways, trying to create space, but her arms shook, and another contraction tore through her with such violence that the motion became meaningless. She folded back over herself, pressing her forehead nearly to the dirt, her breath a harsh, ragged sequence of sounds that she had no control over. "No, don't come closer." The words came out thick and slurred at the edges, pain eating away at her precision. She looked up at him through the fall of her dark hair, this human who had appeared from nowhere, this creature from the other side of every story she'd been raised on, and tried to find something in his face that would confirm what she'd been taught. Cruelty, contempt, the predatory stillness of someone calculating an advantage. She found none of it. What she found instead was harder to make sense of. A man kneeling down to put himself at her level, his big, rough-worked hands spread open and visible, his eyes doing something careful and quiet. He was keeping his distance. He was not reaching for her. He was just there, present, waiting. "I won't hurt you." 3 words, plain as the dirt between them. And yet Elira felt something inside her shift dangerously toward believing them, which frightened her almost as much as the labor. Another contraction. This one was different, deeper, wrong in a way that her body understood before her mind caught up. The pain crested and then did something it hadn't done before. It plateaued, held. She felt a pressure that was not moving correctly, that was building without releasing, and a sound came out of her that she would not remember afterward because her entire consciousness was occupied by the single animal understanding that something had gone wrong. "It's wrong," she was crying. She hadn't realized it until she heard her own voice and recognized the shape of tears in it. Not the clean tears of grief, but the ugly, uncontrolled weeping of genuine fear. "It's not coming." Darian moved closer, not rushing, not crowding, just closing the distance in slow, deliberate steps, the way he might approach an animal in distress, because that was the only frame of reference he had for this, and he knew it wasn't adequate, but it was what he had. He looked at her, really looked, past the tusks, past the green-grey skin, past everything that war had trained him to see as threat, and looked at what was actually in front of him. A woman in labor, alone, in the middle of nowhere, losing the fight. He read it in the angle of her body, the wrong kind of stillness where there should have been progress, the quality of her pain, sustained rather than rhythmic, locked rather than working. He had seen this before, not in a person, but the mechanics were the same. The baby was turned wrong. He swallowed hard. His hands flexed once at his sides. He was a farmer. He had delivered lambs. He had reached inside panicking ewes in the dark of February barns and turned mal-presented offspring, and felt the desperate, slippery pulse of new life against his palms. He was not a healer. He was not trained for this. The gap between delivering a lamb and delivering a child felt in this moment impossibly large, but the alternative was doing nothing. "I need to try," he said, and his voice was steady in a way he wasn't. She grabbed his arm. Her grip was extraordinary, the grip of someone putting everything they had left into a single point of contact. Her amber eyes were level with his, and the thing he saw in them was not hope exactly, it was closer to surrender, the last thing a person holds onto before they let go of all other options. "Don't let me die!" Darian held her gaze. He did not flinch. "You're not going to die!" He pulled out the small water skin from his saddle pack and poured what he had over his hands in the cold wind, rubbing them as clean as he could manage. He breathed. Once, slowly letting the inhale settle everything. "This is going to hurt more," he said, "but you have to trust me." She closed her eyes, nodded once, and Darian, a man who had spent 5 years being afraid of what orcs could do to him, pressed his hands forward into the most vulnerable moment of another person's life, because sometimes the world calls you to be exactly the person you weren't sure you could be. The light was going. It had been going slowly for some time, the grey afternoon deepening by degrees into something colder and less forgiving. But Darian only noticed it now, in the way you notice things you've been too busy surviving to observe. The sky in the west had turned from pewter to a dark, bruised purple. The wind had sharpened, and the temperature, which had been tolerable in the afternoon, had crossed the line into genuine cold. He worked by feel, by what his hands remembered from years of difficult barn deliveries, the orientation of a body in a confined space, the direction of resistance, the geometry of life trying to move through an impossible angle. He kept his hands steady even when his mind was screaming at him that this was too different, that he did not know enough, that the consequences of being wrong were unforgivable. Ilara was extraordinary. That was the only word for it. He had expected her to break, to lose coherence, to give in to the pain in the way that broke most creatures, and instead she was fighting. Her great body shook with continuous effort, and she was making sounds that came from somewhere deeper than voice. But she was still present, still conscious, still with him. Her free hand had found a fistful of dry grass and earth, and was clenched around it so tightly that the knuckles of her green fingers had gone nearly pale. Darian kept talking. He wasn't sure when he'd started. He didn't say anything remarkable. Just words, just his voice, a low and steady thread of sound that kept them both anchored to the present moment. He talked about the cold, about the way the wind was going to push from the south now, about nothing at all. The words didn't matter. The voice mattered. The voice said, "I am still here. I have not run. I have not left you alone in this, millimeter by millimeter." He worked with patience that surprised him, the kind of patience that doesn't come from personality, but from necessity, from understanding that haste would cost everything. He could feel the position slowly correcting under his hands, the geometry shifting towards something possible, and the change was so incremental that he couldn't be certain it was happening until suddenly, there was a different kind of resistance, the right kind. "I cannot do this!" Her voice cracked the night open, pure, raw, human in its despair, or whatever the orc equivalent of human was, which in this moment Darian understood to be exactly the same thing. "Hold on, just a little more!" The wind screamed with her, the dark pressed in from all sides, and Darian felt the exact moment everything changed. A subtle repositioning, a release of resistance, a door swinging open that had been locked shut, and he knew. "Now, push! Now!" He heard her gather herself. He heard the enormous tidal effort of it, a sound that had no words in it, only force, only the absolute refusal of one living thing to be extinguished before it had properly begun. She pushed, and then a sound, small and new and absolutely furious, cutting through the dark and the wind and the cold and 5 years of war and everything terrible that two peoples had ever done to each other. Just a single voice, no bigger than a fist, insisting that it had arrived. Darian's hands were shaking. He hadn't noticed until now, when the urgency had released him and there was space to feel things. He wrapped the infant in the rough cloth from his saddle pack. It was not clean enough, not warm enough, not adequate in any of the ways that a newborn deserved, and he held the small bundle out. Ilara took her son, and for a long moment Darian sat back on his heels in the dark and the cold and the empty borderland, and he listened to the sound of an orc mother meeting her child for the first time, and he felt something inside him that he had no name for, something that had been sealed shut for 5 years, something that was opening. "Thank you." Her voice was a ruin, stripped of everything except sincerity. It was the most honest thing he had ever heard. But they were still alone, in the cold, in the dark, and the night was not done with them yet. Getting her onto the horse was a negotiation of small dignities. Ilara was tall, taller than him by half a head, even when standing, and she was not standing. She was sitting in the dirt, holding her son to her chest with both arms, and she was as exhausted as any living thing Darian had ever seen. Her face, which had been locked in the hard geometry of pain and effort for the past hours, had softened into something that was almost translucent with exhaustion. The lines of it were still strong bones, the heavy jaw, the tusks that caught the last pale fragment of light, but they were no longer a fortress. She looked simply and devastatingly tired. She did not resist when he helped her up. She did not have the strength to resist. And perhaps, Darian thought, there was something else at work too, some slow and reluctant renegotiation of the categories she'd been raised with. He had been present at the worst moment of her life, and had not run, had not used her vulnerability against her, had not done any of the things that the old stories about humans said he would. That cost her something to acknowledge. He could see it costing her, but she let him help. The ride to his farm was slow and cold. The horse moved carefully, as if it understood the fragility of what it carried. Elira sat in front of him, the baby tucked against her chest inside her cloak, and she did not speak, neither did he. The silence between them was not hostile. It was the silence of two people who had crossed some significant threshold together and had not yet found the language for what that meant. His farmhouse was small and low-ceilinged and cluttered with the organized chaos of a man who lived alone. Tools near the door, a half-mended harness hung on the wall. A ceramic bowl on the table that held the last of some dried herbs. It smelled of wood smoke and soil and the faint ghost of something cooking from days ago. Not elegant, but warm. Darian pushed open the door and went directly to the fireplace and got the fire going with the efficiency of long habit. He did not ask himself whether he was making the right decision by bringing her here. The question had a theoretical shape that felt irrelevant against the concrete reality of a new mother and her newborn in the cold. He had a fire, he had blankets, he had water and food and a roof. These were not complicated things to share. He heated water. He found the warmest blankets he owned, rough wool, worn soft, and brought them without ceremony. Elira had settled herself on the floor near the fire because the chair was not made for her dimensions, and she sat cross-legged with the baby in her lap, unwrapping him slightly to check what her hands already knew, that he was whole and breathing and present. The firelight played across both of them, the deep green of her skin, the baby's slightly lighter coloring, his tiny fists clenched against his chest in that universal newborn posture of defiant existence. Darian set the heated water and a clean cloth within her reach, and then sat down across the fire from her, and did not stare. They ate. He had bread and dried meat, and she ate without pride and without gratitude, just steadily, because her body required it. The fire crackled. The baby made small, intermittent sounds, the sounds of healthy newborn sleep, which are among the most reassuring sounds in the world. Outside, the wind that had tried so hard to kill them both moved on to somewhere else. For a few hours that night, in that small, warm room, there was something that could almost have been called peace. Not reconciliation, not friendship. Nothing with a name that either of their peoples would have recognized or allowed. Just two creatures sharing warmth on a cold night, with a new life between them that neither of them had planned for and both of them had fought for. But dawn, when it came, would bring a sound that shattered everything, and remind them both that the world outside did not share what they had found inside these walls. The light that came through the farmhouse's single east-facing window was the pale, tentative light of early morning, the kind that exists before the sun has fully committed to the day. It fell across the floor in a long rectangle, touching the edge of Elira's sleeping form and the still shape of her son beside her, both of them cocooned in Darian's rough blankets. Darian was already awake. He had slept, briefly and lightly, sitting upright near the door with his back against the wall, in the way that years of borderland living had taught him. He woke from habit at the first shift in the quality of the dark, and sat quietly in the grey pre-dawn, listening to the unusual sound of his farmhouse containing other lives. He thought, in that quiet hour, about what he would do when the day fully arrived. She needed more time before she could travel. The baby needed. He wasn't sure what a newborn orc needed exactly, but the basics of warmth and feeding seemed to be covered. He had questions he hadn't asked, out of a politeness that he hadn't realized he possessed until now. Where was she going? Was there someone who knew she was here? Was there? The sound reached him before the light changed. Heavy footfalls, many of them, moving in the coordinated rhythm of a group with purpose. Not travelers, but searchers. The particular cadence that Darian's nervous system recognized from the war years and would recognize for the rest of his life, regardless of how many years of peace intervened. He was at the door before he'd consciously decided to move. They had come out of the east, with the pale morning behind them, which meant they'd traveled through the night. There were 8 of them, orc warriors, armored in the clan fashion with hardened leather and metal plate, carrying weapons that were functional and undecorated in the way of a people who had never confused beauty with killing. They fanned out around the farmhouse in the practiced pattern of encirclement, and the one who stepped forward from the center was taller than the others, older, with the particular stillness of authority. Ilera appeared in the doorway behind Darian. She had moved without sound, her son held against her chest, and when she saw who was standing in the cold morning light, every trace of the exhaustion and vulnerability of the past night vanished from her face, replaced by something else. Something that Darian recognized, the face a person puts on when they understand that the worst thing they feared has arrived. You ran. The leader's voice was flat and enormous, like the sound of stone moving against stone. He did not raise it. He did not need to. You brought shame. Ilera's arms tightened around the baby. Her chin came up. He is mine. He is of the clan, the orc answered. The words landed with the weight of law, of tradition, of generations of belief stacked behind them. Not cruel in their intention, perhaps, but absolute in their certainty. Darian stepped forward. She just gave birth. The 2 warriors moved before he finished the sentence. Not violently, with the calm efficiency of people doing a thing they have done before and expect no difficulty in. One of them intercepted Darian with a forearm against his chest that stopped him as completely as a wall. The other stepped around Ilera and took her son from her arms with practiced ease. The sound Ilera made was not a word. It was the sound of something being taken that cannot be replaced, and it was worse than any sound Darian had heard the night before, worse than anything the war had produced, because it was not the sound of pain, it was the sound of loss. No, please! Darian strained against the arm holding him. He put everything he had against it and felt it give not at all. The warrior holding him did not even look at him, just held him there with the absent firmness of someone holding a door. The leader turned, the warriors moved, and in the space of 30 seconds the morning folded closed around them, and they were gone, leaving only the sound of retreating footsteps and Ilera falling to her knees in the dirt, her empty arms curved in the shape of what had been taken. The silence that followed was the worst silence Darian had ever stood inside. She looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes, and what she said next would cost him more than anything the war had ever asked of him. She did not ask him twice. "Take me there, please." Her voice was barely functional, a cracked and hollowed thing, stripped of everything except the essential request. She was looking at the ground when she said it, not at him, as if she did not trust herself to look up and see refusal in his face. Her arms were still curved in that terrible involuntary shape, holding nothing. "I'll take you," he said. She looked up then. Whatever she saw in his face was apparently sufficient, because she nodded once and did not speak again. She accepted the hand he offered and stood, and they went to saddle the horse. The ride toward Orc territory was harder than any journey Darien had made in recent memory, and not because of terrain. Ilera sat behind him now, her large hands gripping the saddle rather than his sides, maintaining distance even in proximity, and she was still bleeding slowly from the birth, a thing she had not mentioned and would not mention, and which he tracked with sideways glances that she pretended not to notice. He should have insisted she rest, he knew that. But he also knew, with the certainty of someone who has watched another person's face in a moment of pure need, that rest was not a thing she was capable of choosing while her son was somewhere ahead of her. She was operating entirely on the fuel of love and refusal. He recognized both. The territory shifted under them as they traveled. The empty borderland gave way to rougher country. Scattered rock formations, sparse scrub vegetation, the occasional dark shape of a crow watching them from above. The signs of Orc presence grew more frequent. Trail markers cut into the rock in clan symbols, the remnants of old fire pits, paths worn by many feet moving in the same direction. They were being observed. Darien was certain of it. But no one appeared. The rope bridge appeared without announcement, which was typical of things that changed everything. They simply materialized in the path, as if they had always been there. It crossed a ravine that was not wide, but was very deep, perhaps 30 meters across and another 40 down, the bottom invisible in shadow, the sides sheer rock. The bridge itself was old. Old in the particular way of things that had been repeatedly repaired, but never replaced, each generation of repair adding a new layer of distrust to the structure until it was more patch than original. The ropes were thick, but discolored with age and weather. Some of the wooden planks had been replaced recently. Others had not been replaced when they should have been. Darien looked at it for a moment, looked at the ravine, did the private mathematics of necessity. He guided the horse forward. The bridge announced its displeasure immediately. A low, resonant groaning that travelled up through the planks and into the horse's legs, and from there into both of them. The horse moved slowly, each step placed with the extraordinary care of a smart animal that understood instinctively that care was required. The ravine yawned to either side. The wind, which had been merely present on the plains, became concentrated here, channeled by the rock walls into something more intentional. They were perhaps halfway across when the wind shifted. It came from below, a sudden, upward gust that caught the bridge from underneath, and the bridge did what old, overworked things do when they are pushed past what they were designed for. Crack! The sound was precise and final. A primary rope on the right side snapped, the frayed ends whipping outward. The bridge tilted, the horse lurched. Darien felt the world go sideways in a way that had no correction, and then there was a long half-second of perfect weightlessness, the kind that happens just before falling, and then impact, and the sensation of hanging rather than standing, and the roar of the wind in the ravine far below. The horse was gone. Darien was clinging to a rope with both hands, the bridge tilted nearly vertical beneath him, his feet dangling. Somewhere above and to his left, Ilera had caught a cross rope in both hands and was hanging with the grim, locked-jaw efficiency of someone who has decided they are not dying today. "Don't let go!" He wasn't sure which of them said it. Maybe both. The ravine waited below them, with the patient absence of something that has no preference either way, and from somewhere on the far bank, voices, human voices, running toward them. The men who came were farmers and traders from a small settlement 2 miles east of the ravine, people who used the bridge regularly and who had heard the crack of the rope from a distance and understood immediately what it meant. They ran without deliberation, carrying with them the practical equipment of people who live near dangerous terrain: ropes, hooks, the ingrained muscle memory of how to anchor a line and how to pull. There were 5 of them, They reached the near bank and assessed the situation in seconds, which is how people act when they have no time to be afraid of what they're seeing. One of them tied off a rope to the largest rock with a knot that did not invite doubt. Another called across the ravine, "Hold! We're coming!" And they did not comment on what they saw. Not then. Not at the sight of the orc woman hanging from the ruined bridge alongside the human farmer. Both of them holding on to the tilted structure with the white-knuckled intensity of people choosing to remain alive. The rope was thrown. Darian caught it on the second attempt and looped it around his body. The pull was steady and practiced. These were people who had done this before, or something enough like it that their bodies knew the mechanics. He came over the edge of the ravine first and sat in the dust and breathed while the rope went back. Ilera came last. She was heavier than any of the 5 men, and the pull required all of them leaning back in a line, heels dug in, working with the grim synchrony of people at the end of their physical ability. When her hands finally found the edge and she pulled herself up and over and sat down on solid ground, there was a collective release of breath from all 5 men that was not quite a cheer, but was close. She sat, she breathed, she looked at her hands, cut and rope-burned. The palms raw where she'd gripped the bridge, and she closed them slowly into fists and opened them again, as if confirming that they were still there, still hers, still capable. The men tended to the cuts on both of them without ceremony. Water from a skin, strips of cloth torn with practical efficiency, a question here and there about whether anything was broken. Darian answered. Ilera was quiet. One of the farmers, a younger man with a round face and careful eyes, looked at her the way people look when they are revising a prior understanding of the world and finding the revision uncomfortable but correct. Darian told them what had happened. Not everything. There was not time or words for everything, but the essential shape of it. The birth, the clan, the taking of the child. He did not editorialize. He did not ask for anything beyond what he was about to ask for. "We need to keep moving. Do you have a horse you can spare?" The men looked at each other. A conversation happened in the way conversations happen between people who have known each other long enough that they don't need many words. The older one, who seemed to be the weight-bearing point of the group, looked at Ilera directly. For the first time, really looked at her, and then looked at Darian. He said, "You need to get there." The horse they brought was good-natured and willing, a working animal with no opinions about who rode it. Darian helped Ilera mount, because her hands were cut and she was moving more slowly now. The long arc of the night and the morning and the ordeal finally accumulating in her body's ledger. She let him help. That she let him was, in its own way, a more significant thing than many of the larger events of the past hours. "Thank you," Darian said to the men. The older farmer nodded. His eyes went to Ilera and then back. "Bring the horse back when you can, and—" He paused, looking for words that fit the strangeness of the moment. "Good luck." They rode. The orc territory was close now. The landmarks had been growing more distinct, the trail markers more frequent, the sense of being watched more deliberate. There was no longer any question of turning back. There had never been a question, really. Not since the moment Ilera had said please, and Darian had heard something in it that he couldn't unknow. And when the settlement finally appeared in the distance, the smoke, the structures, the motion of many bodies, Darian felt for the first time what it meant to ride willingly into the world of your former enemy. They were met before they reached the gates. 4 warriors stepped out of the tree line with spears leveled and faces that communicated exactly how they felt about a human arriving at the boundary of their territory on horseback, accompanied by the Lord's runaway daughter. Darian kept his hands visible and his pace steady and let Ilera speak. She spoke in the orc tongue, low and fast and firm, and after a moment the spears were raised, though not warmly, and they were escorted inside. The settlement was larger than Darien had expected. He had carried, without fully examining it, the remnant of a soldier's mental image of orc encampments, rough, temporary, built for departure. What he found instead was a community with permanence, buildings of stone and timber, a central fire that looked like it had been burning for years, children visible between the structures before they were quickly gathered inside at the sight of him. Dogs, the smell of cooking, the ordinary archaeology of people who live somewhere rather than simply occupying it. He did not have time to revise his understanding fully because they were taken directly to Gorath. The Lord of the Iron Tusk clan was exactly what his name implied and exactly what the war had made him. He was old in the way of something that has been forged rather than grown, every year visible not as softening but as compression, the lines of his face deep and permanent, his eyes the particular shade of amber that Ilara had inherited, currently aimed at his daughter with an expression that contained several competing things and showed none of them freely. The baby was in the arms of an older orc woman standing near the fire. Ilara saw him immediately, the involuntary step forward, the arrest of motion when she controlled it, and her hands flexed at her sides. Gorath spoke, not to Darien, to her. What happened? And Ilara told him. She told him everything, and she told it plainly, without the softening gloss of someone trying to manage a reaction. The flight, the labor in the borderland, the baby who would not come, and the wrong position, and the hours of cold and fear. She told him about Darien's hands working in the dark. She told him about the farmhouse and the fire and the warmth. She told him about the rope bridge, and the 5 men who threw their ropes without hesitation across the void, to 2 people hanging from the ruins of something old and broken. The great hall was silent while she spoke. Gorath did not move. She took 1 step forward. "Father, the war is over." The words were not a plea. They were not a challenge. They were a statement of fact, delivered with the clarity of someone who had lived through the evidence of what she was saying. "I don't want this for my son. Humans saved me. He saved me." She held Gorath's gaze. Her eyes were steady, red-rimmed still, exhausted still, but steady. Enough of war. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. The before silence had been a hall full of people carefully not revealing what they thought. The after silence was a single man doing something real and difficult and internal, reconsidering, revising, holding the image of his daughter's face against every conviction he had built over a lifetime of war and measuring the two against each other. He looked at the baby. He looked at Darien. Something moved in those amber eyes, a tectonic shift, slow and irreversible. He made a gesture. The older woman carried the infant across the hall and placed him in Ilara's arms. Ilara pressed her son to her chest and closed her eyes for one long moment, and the sound she made was too small and too complete to be called anything other than what it was, a heart returning to its body. "You chose your path," Gorath said, "and I accept it." He turned to Darien. He studied him for a long moment, the plain face, the work-worn hands, the mud still on his boots from the borderland, and arrived at some conclusion that did not entirely surprise him, though it required the better part of his pride to accommodate. "You saved my daughter, and brought her back." He raised his hand. A warrior led forward a horse, black, broad-chested, with the composed assurance of an animal that has been bred and trained by people who understand horses as deeply as anything else. It was not a gift in the small sense of the word. It was restitution, recognition, the orc equivalent of a debt acknowledged. "This is yours, in place of what you lost." Darien looked at the horse. He looked at Gorath. He gave the slight bow that felt right, not deep enough to be submission, not shallow enough to be disrespect, and accepted. "Thank you." He left the next morning. The sun was early and low, cutting gold lines across the plains, and the new horse moved with the long, efficient stride of something bred for distance. Behind him, tied to the saddle, was the borrowed horse from the 5 farmers, which he would return as promised. He rode west across the borderland, across the cracked pale earth where he had knelt in the dark and the cold and the wind 2 days ago, and made a decision that had asked everything of him, and given him back something he hadn't known he'd lost. He rode without hurrying. The plains were the same as they had always been, empty, flat, wind-combed, belonging to no one. But he was not the same man who had crossed them. Because sometimes the thing that redefines a world is not a treaty or a battle or a king's proclamation. Sometimes it is one person stopping when they hear a cry in the dark, staying when they could have left, helping when there was no obligation and no guarantee, and nothing to gain except the knowledge that they had been, in that moment, exactly what someone needed. Peace does not announce itself. It does not arrive with banners. It arrives the way morning light arrives, quietly, incrementally, finding its way through every crack in what was closed. And it asks only this: the courage to leave the past where it lies and build something new with whatever your hands can reach. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like, it helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. Orc-Bound Legacy.